Hi, everybody. It's Tuesday night. It's time for our roundtable. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. If you're here watching live, please post your comments tonight. I will be watching for those comments and questions. If you're watching this at a later time and something comes up, post it to my page, and we will be responding to those. So, as usual, right at the get-go here, I'm going to remind you, please share this video along with other information that I have out there. Remember justify.org. We are in the full swing of things. We are trying to grow our membership, so please visit justdefy.org. That's our website. You can also find us under that name, specifically justified.org, on Facebook or on LinkedIn as well. Our first event is going to be on October 10th. We are looking at having 3 different locations rally on that day on the Front Range. From Loveland, we're looking down hopefully to Castle Rock. We are still working out a few details on the locations, but we definitely are looking for those 3 locations. We're going to have a rally that day. There will be petitions on site for you to sign. And also we are inviting all candidates to be part of this rally. We'd like you there, candidates, with your signs, your flyers, be ready to speak and mingle and get to know the people there. We want to raise, just get our spirits up and show our conservative solidarity that day. Ballots are going to be dropping, so we want to get out there, be seen. We will be live broadcasting from all 3 sites. Everybody else is also encouraged to be streaming live from there. And we just really want to put a presence out there on that day. So check it out. I've started posting all of the information on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'll be adding it to our website. And we also have a Facebook group. So please, when you're out there checking it out, ask to join so we can get you into our group. All right. So tonight, we're going to be talking about the millennial generation and gaining understanding to win with the millennials. So I have Kavika with us. He is the vice chair for the Adams County GOP and someone with whom I have had numerous conversations about this topic. He is very knowledgeable, and I'm excited to have him on tonight. So Kavika, say hi and then tell everybody just a little bit more about you and what you do.
Absolutely. Well, hey, first off, thank you for having me on here with you, Cynthia. It's a huge honor to be able to have that opportunity. And so, yes, I'm a millennial. I'm smack dab in the millennial generation, being born in the late 1980s. And in general, millennials are that 1980 time frame up to about the early 90s, mid 90s. And so that's where I come from as an expertise on that, doing a lot of learning about my generation, especially when I entered into politics, because conservatives especially typically have a really large misunderstanding of my generation as a whole. And then got my bachelor's degree in music education, and I am a teacher in Denver Public Schools now, where I've been working for the last 5 years. This is now my 6th year in district and in Adams 14. And so I had to deal with many of the issues that do crop up within the millennial generation: social justice, equity. I've served as an ethnic minority council member when I was in Adams 14, which was a response to the Office of Civil Rights issue that had cropped up prior to me joining the school district. And I wound up being part of the response team to that, to try and hold the district accountable for certain things that had occurred that definitely were not okay. And, my time in Denver Public Schools and seeing the trajectory that it's on, politically speaking, is a little concerning to me as I'm looking at that. But then I'm also working again with quite a few millennials in that setting and situation. And so understanding my generation has been a real heavy and important part of the work that I'm doing, even though it's not directly in my job description.
Right. Well, and I'll share this with our audience, whoever's watching. One of the reasons Kamika and I have enjoyed talking about this so much is that he has the personal experience of being part of that generation. My experience comes from having taught college for 10 years and having worked with quite a few students and people over that time frame who are part of the millennial generation. Also having worked in psychology for years and just being a social psychologist myself in a lot of ways, done a lot of studying about not just the millennial generation, but about generational patterns and the understanding of how cohorts form their belief systems and the perceptions about them and that type of thing. So it's been, every time we talk about it, we both kind of bring that different perspective. And in being in political activism right now, my real interest in getting people to have a better understanding about the generation, particularly when it comes to that political piece of it, is that we have to be more inclusive in the way in which we bring people into politics. And I believe with every ounce of my body that the Republican Party definitely needs to start to be inclusive in a much more proactive way with those who are in the millennial generation. And I think that there is more conservatism out there than what we're willing to recognize because we have labeled and stereotyped. And so we are excluding people who could be part of a greater movement toward a unified conservative front, especially with those unaffiliated voters that fall in that age range. So, hi, Nancy. Nancy Palazzi just joined us. Thank you for joining us, Nancy. Nancy is running for State Board of Education, so please check out her website out there. We need her so bad right now. It's such a critical position. So, wave to you, Nancy. Glad to see you're here. Let us know if you have any questions or comments. So without kind of further ado, so to speak, let me ask you, I kind of have a few questions that I'd like to pose to you tonight, Kavika. You said you're smack dab in the middle of the millennial generation, right? We've talked about that before. So how did you formulate your values in life? How do you think that differed from your peers, from your cohort? Do you think that something at the core of your values was different that allowed you to see or be part of this conservative movement, or sort of where are you with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a really good question in a lot of ways because my particular upbringing was a lot different than the stereotype that you typically hear when it comes to millennials and what they interact with. So I grew up in a single parent household. My mom was working 3-4 jobs. My mom was a teenager when I was born. And so that really set me up on a much different trajectory than a lot of the millennials that I grew up around. A lot of my peer groups typically had 2 parents in the home, and even if they both had to work a job, they still had both parents in the house that were fulfilling a more traditional type of role. I also had the ability to grow up in the house underneath my mom, who's Gen X, and on that younger middle side of it. And one of the intriguing things that I always found was the amount of work that I wound up having to do and life skills that I wound up having to develop because of that circumstance that would eventually form me into a conservative. But it took a while. Within the education system, I was always being given a lot of components that were related to social justice, really get in touch with your emotional side. finding out what a man is, that's something that has been work that I'm doing now as an adult and was
Right.
not on my radar until after I got out of college, because the education system which I was immersed in was always pushing, well, guys cry, guys gotta guys feel pain, you have to be super open with all of your emotions. And there's a lot of those factors that I think we lost with millennial men especially, and then millennial men as well, receiving a lot of articles and reading and discussions really targeting us and shaming us for just being male, which is terrible, a terrible, terrible thing. And so those items really set me up for my eventual trajectory to conservatism. My mother was an entrepreneur, and during that time, I would go work construction jobs through her day labor company, oftentimes interviewing people who were homeless, disabled veterans, or people who had drug addictions, alcohol addictions, prostitutes, whatever it was. I would be on job sites with these people, learning their stories, learning how they got into the situations they were in, and really gaining their perspective on matters. And more often than not, what I found is that many of them are there by choice, which wound up pulling me into a more conservative realm, because it instilled in me the value that people need to work for what they have and earn it, but they should also be respected for what they have earned and where they've gained and been given because of that work. And the other thing that really turned me on to conservatism all the way around was, I remember when I registered to vote. So I was registered to vote underneath the Obama drive, get out the vote drive that had occurred there on my college campus. And I remember I was really, really excited about it because I actually had a voice. I finally had a say in what my country was going to look like. And I was talking to my mom about that. And I was telling her about all the injustices. And my mom, I remember the one thing she made me do, and this is why I became a conservative, because up until this point, I was a hard, like liberal mindset. I thought socialism was a good idea. I thought we needed social justice. I thought that we needed stricter gun controls. And what my mom did was she told me, type in the name of every presidential candidate and then read their platform. And the way you're going to do it is type their name in and say platform. Or type their name in and say issues. You can do either of those two and you'll find it. And she said, write down the candidates that you align with. And so I wrote down all their names, and I found I only had one Democrat on my list. And it
Let me
was,
guess.
Huh?
And who was that?
It was Night Horse. And he eventually became a Republican. So, but at that point in time, I thought I was going to vote a completely Democrat ballot, and I didn't. In fact, I was so opposed to what the Democrats were saying that I decided, okay, well, I'm this much against them. Maybe it's just the candidates, because everybody was telling me vote Democrat, vote Democrat. So I went and I looked up their actual platform that was there. And as I started reading through it, I thought that, I don't believe that everybody should be just handed a living wage. I think it needs to be earned. I don't think that somebody should get a job just because of the color of their skin. I think that they should be gauged based upon the merits of their character, just like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. We
were just talking before we started this, and I'll tell you right now, everybody get ready. Somebody's going to call me a racist, right? I firmly believe that affirmative action is one of the most racist things we've ever done.
Yeah.
It reduces people to the color of their skin. And I think there are, I don't know, 1 billion better ways
Yeah.
for us to be equitable in workplaces, and embrace our diversity in this country. But I wanted to touch on something that you said, because I wanted to ask you kind of what are some of the things that has happened with the millennial generation that you think has contributed so much to their liberalism. But you mentioned something in your first answer to me that I have talked a lot about too, and I think this is one of those really like underlying issues that has been problematic with your generation, and that's the emasculation of men. um, I feel like we have basically stolen manhood from an entire generation of men. Um, and again, this is like a pendulum type of situation, right? We have a tendency to do this with so many different things in this country. And as a psychology professor for years, I always talked about this pendulum swing. We did it in so many different ways with your generation. We went, if you look at things like masculinity, we did it with that. We looked at it with child discipline. For generations, we had very authoritarian parenting styles, right? My generation, Gen X, we were still raised in that authoritarian type of parenting style. At sort of the tail end of my generation, parents were starting to get into that. Hopefully, what we were aiming for authoritative, right? But what ended up happening is there was this knee-jerk reaction to that authoritarian type of that just, it's my way or the highway. Why is that wrong? Because I said so. Why do you have to do it? Because I said so. Spanking, whatever it was. We had this knee-jerk reaction, and the pendulum swung so far that we had an entire generation of parents that became super permissive. Okay, and that really started with your generation. Your generation was the first generation to see kind of almost a systemic social change in what we thought was okay in parenting and parental discipline in this country.
Mm-hmm.
We also did that with masculinity, right? So we went from a situation in this country where for years women were in the shadows of men, right? And masculinity and was used as an excuse for all kinds of things, including violence and infidelity and all kinds of different things. There's a whole other thing there. Boys will be boys. I also think that hurts nobody but men. But so then the pendulum swung there too, right? And again, your generation, I think, suffered the brunt of this as well. So we went to a permissive parenting style in a very deep-rooted social movement. We went into almost a hatred of masculinity and what we thought that stood for or what it did stand for at one time. We also, at that time, started to make the movement, right? Because we had the civil rights movement, but there was still this huge component of inclusivity that was missing still for decades after that, right? And so right at that beginning of the 90s, again, we started to really see the pendulum started to swing again. And so when we have that effect, then it goes too far. And we did that again with the social justice movement. So your generation was told being male is bad. It means you're violent. It means you're horrible. Your parents should be your friends, and you can't discipline your children or they're going to become serial killers. That all white people are racist and evil.
Yep.
And so on and down the line. And so we have this whole generation of people that were, for lack of better words, indoctrinated into the ills of our society and our history as a country and a culture in the absence of showing any of the positive of that. What do you think about that? I mean, is that in being part of that generation, do you feel like that's an accurate assessment? Or
I would say that's a very, very accurate assessment, especially for about the midpoint of my generation to the younger portion of it, which lines right up with the timeline that you gave for the pendulum swing, as you so well placed that. Uh, for men, one of the things that we were always told, yes, boys are going to be boys. And part of the learning for a boy into becoming a man is to receive that rod of discipline after we do something wily or boyish that we do and get into our antics, because yes, that's who we are. And we do learn very well from those physical consequences. And when I looked around at a lot of my peers, so I also grew up in an extremely minority area. And so you could tell the difference, a very strong difference between the people who had a strong moral foundation within their household versus people who didn't. Okay. And the people who had that strong moral foundation, yeah, there was definitely that authority. You know, you messed up, yeah, you're getting whipped or you're getting the belt or whatever. Some of the hardest working, most disciplined children that I saw out of my peer group growing up came out of those groups where they had a really strong male figure in the house that was willing to take the disciplinary steps if necessary, made sure that faith and morality were a high priority within the household, and worked to provide. And when you start to break that down on the masculinity side of things, that leads us to the three things that almost every single faith says a male should be. Now, I was a pagan at this time. They had a slightly different view on this. But within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and many of these, it's you're the provider, you're the protector, and you're the priest of your household. You know, and in that role, that's where we get the men that people so often cry for and call for, that my generation now, I fear, really lacks. We're far in between. And when we show that side of ourselves, somebody said it so elegantly in one of our staff meetings at work. Oh, it was just so much masculine energy. It's threatening and intimidating. I've never seen that much. And they got so heated and so emotional about it because they had never seen what a really strong, good man looked like. And they took it out on a really, really good man. And, you know, and it's unfortunate. You know?
But we do that with a lot of things. We take the negative piece of something and then we personify it as being the end all be all for everybody that falls into that group.
Yeah.
And, we just did that in so many areas as your generation was growing up in your formative years, that we've created this. I feel like your generation, and I don't, it's hard, and being a Gen Xer and stuff, I think it's suffice it to say that, right, the generations ahead of you, we definitely have a few stereotypes of your generation. Not all of them great. And so, there can be a joke about it. But I feel like as a whole, a lot of times the generation is like blunted affect. That's the word I think of. And that's like a technical psychology term, right? Blunted affect is a term we use in psychology to describe when people they can't get too happy, too sad, too anything. Like, I feel like the whole generation's kind of like, right, because they haven't been shown good ways to come through this. They haven't been shown, okay, yeah, so we had slavery, we had whatever we had, but we also had this, and you can make a choice. You can choose this different path. Yes, we have men who beat their wives. We had men who use, the masculinity in a negative way. But we also have good men out there who do these things. And I feel like that's where we got. Oh, Kathleen just joined us. Hi. Kathleen is the chair for House District 35. She just jumped on, so thank you. So she just asked, because I think she likes to get to the point here, and this is a good question. And this was going to be my next question I was leading into right now. How do we stop this from happening in the future? So what do we do as being a millennial and knowing really, kind of all these intricacies of your generation? What suggestions do you have for us to change this, to turn it around, to start to be inclusive of that generation?
Absolutely. So the first thing to understand with millennials when it comes to Gen Xers and boomers is right out the door, you've already got a fence you have to go through. And so whenever you bring up politics, the way we usually are approached by boomers and by Gen Xers is extremely aggressively and extremely authoritatively. And the coping mechanism that we were taught as we were aging through societal standards and norms for millennials was to shut down. And that is kind of the defensive mechanism that we have. And so it's not that we don't want to engage in those conversations. It's that we have a very deep-seated emotional attachment to it. And because we were taught and raised in this idea of moral subjectivity, you can thank the space or the Cold War for that one. Because we were raised with moral subjectivity, because we were not really taught how to cope with things, we shut down up front, and then we get confrontational in other means. So Facebook, social media, those were the areas that we found as our outlets. And instead of utilizing healthy outlets, we really went to that and became addicted to those things. And so
it's almost like a passive aggressive pattern. Where when you're in an actual interpersonal relationship or conversation with someone in real life, right, and that conversation becomes, and I don't even necessarily want to use the word confrontational, but in any way it challenges, right, then you're saying, so the point is to retreat from that and then to act out in some other way, the aggression that you feel that you weren't really taught as a generation how to express that in a live conversation with another person.
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that. So just right out the door, you're already talking to a wall. So there's a couple of ways you can break that down. Right out the door, millennials are huge on environmental issues. I would generally say, just speaking personally in the interactions I have with others, that I tend to lean more towards the left side of things when it comes to environmental issues, with the one exception, which is climate change. I believe that is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And back in the 1800s, and NASA has this on their website, you can look it up, it's called axial tilt. And we experienced an axial tilt a couple of years ago of about 2 to 3 degrees. It varies about 2 to 3 degrees, and that can actually explain every single climate phenomenon that we're dealing with right now, because it was predicted, and that was back in the 1880s. And so with that set aside, in general, I do hold pretty true to the millennial perception on environmental issues. Why is that? Because we were raised on environmental issues. A lot of the cartoons that were coming out in the 70s and the 80s were really geared towards environmental activism. We haven't known a time when the EPA was not like a really big deal. And then when I was in college, I had tons and tons, like for my writing classes, for my science classes, for my history classes, environmental issues were a major component of my education. And so when it comes to that area, if you can get a millennial talking about that, you're already starting to chip away at that wall. And they're more open to conversations on topics that are environmentally driven. So like what Cory Gardner did recently with that legislation, that was huge when it comes to resonating with millennials, which is our largest voting base right now in Colorado. And Hickenlooper can't tout that. In fact, Hickenlooper did for a liberal person, he did quite a bit for oil and gas in a lot of ways, but he came out of that industry, so it makes a little more sense. Granted, yes, he did do some damage to it, but he millennials wouldn't resonate as much with him in environmental areas as they would with Cory Gardner. And then
it is always interesting because this is just a secondary point. I find that when I do have a conversation with someone, smack dab in the middle of that generation, and we are able to communicate directly with each other, that I find that the values that those folks have are much more conservative than what even they think or understand.
Yes.
And that's when I do find someone who's that age who is open to having a conversation, learning, thinking about things or questioning things and just hearing different stuff. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are about your age in the last year, and we've talked about politics, and they're like, oh, I'm a Democrat. And then we talk, and they've actually been open to talking, which I think is great. And at the end of the conversation, they go, like they're going, huh, am I really a Democrat? And they say, I think it's possible you're Republican, you just don't quite know it yet.
Well, I'd agree with that. In general, a lot of our values do line up with the Republican Party, but we were taught a leftist view of history. So many millennials can't even identify that Abraham Lincoln, who was one of the founding members of the Republican Party, was hugely responsible for the freeing of slaves and for the abolishment of slavery and the installation of rights for people who were slave, the minorities and the downtrodden. And even during those times, I would dare say, the Irish, who were a slave of sorts, they weren't even considered white by many people. My stepdad, his grandfather was labeled a mulatto. And if you don't know that term, yes, it is a racially derogatory term, but it separated Irish people even. And so he was of the slave class, if you will, when he was born, and wasn't even identified as an actual human being. And so you see that dichotomy happening within our history. You see that type of thinking come out, and you really want to get millennials, start giving them an alternative perspective. But the way you have to do it is through questioning that primes them emotionally. Right. And you kind of have to go in this roundabout way to get us to convince ourselves that it was our idea in the first place. Somebody who does an excellent job at that is Ben Shapiro. I have to tell you, he is phenomenal at that. Yeah. And it's just, he knows how to hit you hard so that it solicits an emotional reaction. Because millennials are very emotional in general, just generally speaking. And then probing questions that cause them to utilize affirmatives. If you can keep the millennial using affirmatives, you're going to get them back around to that realization point that you were talking about.
Oh, hey, Phil Covarrubias just jumped on. So Phil, hi, thanks for joining us. Phil Covarrubias is running for county commissioner in Adams County. Please check out his Facebook page and his site. That's Phil for ADCO. I think I got that right. Did I get that right? Could be good. But you'll find him out there. Just look him up and check him out. Great guy. This man has had some tremendous endorsements recently. And he is just ready to go. So please make sure you check out Phil. Go out there, check out all of his information and support him. This is a critical position for us to get this year in Adams County if we want to start to get some of our freedoms back, get our children back to school, get back to work, get our industries going. We need a county commissioner to get in there and start help changing that around. So thanks, Phil, for joining us. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but anytime
No
I see a
worries.
candidate come on, what I want to do is just plug them. So, you know,
Absolutely.
Kavika, you said something that, the generation can tend to be emotional and you have to connect with that emotional piece. Even though I have felt like there's that kind of passive aggressive thing you talked about, the problem with the direct interpersonal communication, because of course you guys were raised with all these devices between your thumbs, and that type of stuff. And there does tend to be some emotional acting out, almost, it seems
Mhm.
like, with, where you see adults in that generation sort of having what I call a temper tantrum. Um, I still think that intellectually, millennials like to think of themselves as being intellectual or
Mhm.
being based in logic or whatever it is. And they always tout, well, I believe in science, I like facts, etc. One of the ways that I've made some headway with a few people that I was talking to you about that I've come across is I will simply say to them, and I like to pose things. I like to do things that Columbo style. I'll pose a question and I will say, do you happen to know which of the two political parties, and whether it's Democrats or Republicans, fought hardest to stop desegregation? Right? Because we can go to slavery, and that was a long time ago, but
Mhm.
desegregation wasn't quite that long ago,
No.
right?
Mhm.
Who was it that wanted to keep segregation? The Republicans or the Democrats? Well,
And
we know the answer. It was the
right.
Democrats,
Mhm.
right? They fought against it.
Yes.
And I like to pose a question like that because I think that, racism, segregation, desegregation, social justice, all of that type of thing is such a hot button for your generation. I mean, it's one
Yes.
of those things that causes us temper tantrums, I think, sometimes.
Mhm.
Um, is that I think to find a question like that where you pose that question to them and then they have to find the answer and they
Yep.
find out it's contradictory to what they have been told,
Yep.
right? Or if you say, do you like a lot of taxes? You work hard for your money or you work for your money, whatever. Do you like to keep your paycheck, or would you prefer to have more of your paycheck taken away and controlled by someone else?
So that
Usually,
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
That particular one, actually, with taxes, you have to be really careful. How long have they been in the workforce? If they
Right.
are in college, you are going to hear them say something very much like, "Oh, I would be fine if they raised my
Oh,
taxes and took that." If they've been in the workforce for a year, about 2 years, I'd give them 2 years before you
but
really hit them with that one.
those folks that are in college right now that are that 18 to 22 are not millennials.
No, those are Gen Z.
That's
Hmm.
Gen Z.
Yep.
Totally different. I'm talking about people that are 32 years old, right?
Right.
Actually been working now for a
Hmm.
while, right in the smack dab of that. They've actually started to work in a position now where they understand that they have to earn money.
Yes.
And again, it's, who's going to take more of your money? Just
Hmm.
picking one little thing. And you do have to be careful with taxes because they
Hmm.
have been taught to feel guilty for
Yes.
earning anything, to feel guilty if they're white, to feel
Hmm.
guilty if they have any kind of privilege whatsoever, what they perceive as privilege.
Hmm.
Right. And that's that huge pendulum swing on social justice, right? If you're
Yes.
white, if you're not living in poverty, if you actually have a job or a roof over your house, of course, you're supposed to feel guilty. Um, so you do have to be careful with the tax issue. But the one that I really like is the desegregation,
Hmm.
the environment, those types of things, because those are such hot buttons for people in that generation. And when they hear the answer, it just kind of you have to drop your guard if you are saying you're a hardcore Democrat and you're also a hardcore social justice advocate, right?
Hmm.
And then you find out that the Democrats were the ones that wanted to keep everybody segregated less than a half a century ago.
Yep.
That's a like intellectual dichotomy it causes cognitive dissonance. And when someone experiences that cognitive dissonance, they have the capacity then to make change.
Yes. And there is a caveat to that approach. So that is definitely the approach I would take as a general rule of thumb with millennials.
Okay.
I outlined that. You've outlined the exact same thing, right? But one of the fights that you're going to have to deal with is helping them understand that there was not a political change. Okay, one of the big things that has been coming out of a lot of the universities, especially recently and with the millennials in my group and younger, is that we were taught, unless we had a really conservative history teacher in the colleges or a very responsible teacher or a conservative teacher in our secondary education, we were taught that the Democrats and Republicans switched sides and that Abraham Lincoln was actually a Democrat. Which, of course, if you go down the history, is not true. Okay. But understand that the lens of history that the millennials were really raised with was a leftist version of that. Yeah. And so you have to be prepared to help guide them down those paths. Now, if they're pretty fast on their feet, pretty solid thinkers, they'll put two and two together and jump right with what you're talking about. But if they've really been bought and sold into this very hard leftist rhetoric, you're gonna have a fight on your hands in that realm of things, because now you have to give them a balanced perspective of history that they do not have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, the left has rewritten history to suit their needs.
Yes. Sounds like 1984.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just, we see it now. We still see it now. You know, the lies about history and what they are and what happened and et cetera. Well, I think, I covered all the questions I had for you. I want to know the mistakes we make. I think you talked about that. What can we do? How to address it? Mm-hmm. One thing that I want to say is I'm not part of that generation. I am definitely a Gen Xer. I am in the middle of the raised by TV generation. Our generation has so many unique caveats to it as well. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a generation that has continued to just be the ignored child in a lot of ways between the boomers and the millennials. But we're a little bit of a powerhouse if you really get us going. But being part of that generation, it's just so intriguing to me to continue to learn. And it is something that I encourage anybody who are in generations ahead of the millennials, is that you do have to stop and be inclusive. And it can be difficult because that passive aggressive thing, that inability to communicate in person, those types of things that the generation was raised with, and much not to their own fault, right? But they were raised in this way. Those things can be infuriating oftentimes to generations before. My generation was the last generation to know before we had an electronic device in our hand every second of every day. Your generation, maybe when you were little tiny kids, right? But for the most part, you were raised in this era of technology and stuff, where my generation really wasn't. We really were raised before that. Mm-hmm. We were going into college coming out of college and stuff by the time we started seeing that movement. And I just want to keep saying, stop, think, find common ground, mm-hmm. look for a way to include, and be aware of these things. Educate yourself as to not just the millennial generation, but every generation. What makes people tick? We have a whole nother generation, guys, already, Gen Z. These guys are getting ready to vote. I mean, we're coming into them going into college and stuff. We have, I don't know what we're calling this next generation. I guess we'll start over. We'll go to A. But we need to start to figure this out, how to work more inclusively across the age gap. And And that's the only way we're going to become a strong conservative, have a strong conservative front.
Yes.
You know?
No, absolutely. And we're definitely coming into a point in time with millennials, especially, where the ones who are conservative are starting to show those signs of a little bit of the apathy towards what's going on politically. And a lot of that, is the ridicule that we've been hearing. Like, I can't drive down the street listening to a conservative radio when they're talking about the topic of millennials and not get put down at least 5 to 10 times in a 5 or 6 minute span of time. And that's not doing anything to help conservative thinking. I mean, it's one thing, a joke, like one joke here or there. Generally, millennials can take that and are fine. They might shut off for a second. So they're like, okay, wait, was that a joke? Was it not a joke? And a lot of that is because the coping mechanism that we were given was social media or video games or television. And really, I'm from the part of the millennial generation where I do remember a time before internet where I actually had to go outside and play and would get locked out of the house. Yeah. But some of the younger ones, oh man, they can't handle any of that.
Yeah.
And so I have to mirror and echo that and really push that home, that inclusive component, and really taking the time to understand what millennials came from, because in general, millennials do not feel like we were given a good circumstance when we're walking in. We're going to have to deal with the largest debt that our country has ever had, period. Which is one of the things, if you've heard of Article 5 Convention of States, they want to address that. That's one of the things they want, regardless of what you believe about them. That is one of the things they want to address. And I know that will resonate among millennials because they want to see the debt stop, because we're seeing the writing on the wall that we're inheriting that. We want freedom. We want those same opportunities that we feel were given to Gen X and to boomers. And the other component that you're fighting against is that we were promised the world. And then when we entered the workforce, we realized, oh, wait a minute here. I'm not going to start off with that 6-figure income. I'm not going to walk into a situation where I'm debt free. I'm not going to walk into a situation where I'm working in a field that I actually enjoy. I'm one of those weirdos. I have a liberal arts degree, and I'm a music. I majored in music. If I lose my education job, now I have to get really creative with how I'm going to make money, because I bought into that rhetoric, just go do what you love and everything will be taken care of. And then you get tacked on with this enormous college debt that, to be honest, with the field of choice that you made, it's kind of hard to pay off.
Because your generation is not the first one that had that college debt. My generation had a ton of college debt.
Yep, I agree.
And we also were faced with a lot of those same things. We were given some opportunity, but our generation also accumulated a ton of debt from higher education. Yes. The difference is, as children, we were raised in a suck it up mentality.
Yes.
And so we expected there to be very difficult things in life.
Yes.
Where I feel like your generation was raised to never feel uncomfortable. Yes. The minute, oh my God, she's uncomfortable, fix it. Oh my God, she doesn't, it is, oh my gosh, we have to, my generation wasn't like that. We were still in the kind of suck it up buttercup type of thing. So we learned to cope. We learned the coping skills. And we were also raised talking with people face to face, shaking their hand, having conversations, and not having that other outlet. So so we had some of that stuff. We just learned how to deal with it.
Yep.
I accumulated a tremendous amount of college debt going through graduate school. I had to take out student loans. It wasn't free. And so it's how we've been raised to deal with those things.
Yes.
Well, we've gone a little bit long, so we better wrap up.
Okay.
But, I'll just end with this thing that I say a lot of times, and I've said it to other people. The baby boomer generation, I don't think had anything handed to them. They went out and they fought I like sometimes well up thinking about what that generation did. Yes. Literally as a generation, the sacrifice they made, the change they brought about, how they fought tooth and nail. And I believe truly as a group of people that they have affected history permanently and forever in a way that we may never see again. I mean, it was a generation of people who became more educated and accumulated wealth and fought through more tragedy and war and social unrest and a number of different things and managed to come out of that fighting like hell. And they wanted something better for their kids. They wanted to change things. But whenever I hear someone say, oh, millennial, and I've done it, I've made jokes about it or comments about it, right? I mean, this is part of our culture. It's also because they're younger. And I think, we just kind of, we give slack to the younger generations. But remember, whatever the millennial generation has brought forward, we raised you. So, and mostly the youngest of the boomers raised millennials. So people a little bit older than me, I'm still a little bit too young to have raised a millennial child. But that tail end of the baby boomers, they raised millennials. So when they get all grumpy about it, they need look no further than the mirror to figure out why this is the way it is. And if you can just keep that in mind, maybe you can have a more inclusive attitude about it. And it's not to say, oh, bad you, and I'm not deferring blame for anybody's behavior on their parents. That's stupid. I believe in taking responsibility for your own actions, regardless of how you're raised. I guess what I'm saying is we're all in this together. And so we have our varying differences between our cohorts. But if we are to continue to affect positive change, we must find a way to come across that and work together. And that's just so important right now, especially we are faced with an evil in this country that is of monumental proportion. And if we cannot figure out how to motivate the masses of millennials that are out there that are going to be moving into that primary position of voting, we are dead in the water.
Yes.
Dead in the water. So we have got to figure out a way to make this happen. So my call to action tonight is, if you are part of the baby boom generation, if you are part of Gen X, I want you to intentionally, purposefully have a conversation with someone who's in a millennial generation. Go out and have an open, unbiased conversation with someone. Initiate the conversation. Talk to them. Listen, ask questions. That's my call to action for the week.
Yep.
All right. Well, we better wrap up. My second call to action, last call to action. I have quite a few of these. I'm crazy. So thank you, Kavika, for being here with me. I know it was short notice. With everything else that's been going on with Justify and a number of other different things, I just seem sometimes like I'm doing this at the last minute. But I want to keep the forum going. And although a lot of people don't necessarily join us right on the night of the broadcast, I do know that we get a lot of visitors that watch the videos. And so it's important for us to continue to bring these topics out there and at least get people thinking about them. So I really appreciate you being here. And check out justify.org, JUSTDEFY.org, our big event on October 10th. And that's going to coincide too with Adams County GOP calling event that day, right? So you guys will be calling from, is it 9 to 1? So make sure that the 10th of October, just eat breakfast and don't plan on getting home till about 10 that night. We have a lot for you to do.
Yeah.
Call, walking, attending the rally, and then probably walking some more. So
Yeah.
ballots will be dropping that weekend, and it is going to be critical. That weekend, October 9th, 10th, 11th, please, if you are dedicated to our conservative movement, if you want to see our candidates elected, please dedicate that weekend to really making a presence out there as ballots are dropping, and helping get those Republican votes back in. Any last words, Kavika?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you just took them right there. It's like, hey, you got to be there. You got to get involved. No, millennials as well, if you're looking for that, definitely ask those questions, get in touch with them. They also respond to your action or your inaction, especially if you're an older generation, because whether or not we want to admit it, we're still looking to you to know how we should be and where we should be. And the other big thing, morality.
Yeah.
We need to bring back the moral compass of this country, because the longer we sit in moral subjectivity, which is what we saw, Nietzsche and Sam Harris are two guys who really advocated for moral subjectivity. But one of the things they both said is that if you take a moral stance, you are no longer a moral subjectivist. And so we need to begin to realize that and start instilling that in our actions and our lives, because millennials are looking for that. Because the reason why we're not the reason why we are the way we are, especially the young men, is because we've lost that moral compass. So get involved in your faith, get praying, get us connected. And if there's anything I can do to support in any way, feel free to reach out. You can get me at my name, Kavika Bertholet, Kawika, B as in boy, ERTHELETTE 24@gmail.com, or at my direct phone number, 303-591-7163. I love talking about the millennial generation and how it compares to other generations, because there are a lot of differences, but there are a ton of similarities as well. Yeah. And so it's just fun to talk with people about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for being on. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Make sure you're getting out the vote. Remember, it's not just enough to put Election Day on your calendar and vote.
Yes.
If you truly want to see our freedoms protected, our liberty back, our industry started, our kids in school, all of these things happening, you need to not just plan to vote, but to bring someone else along with you. And I don't just mean pick them up and drive them over there, but find someone who's on the fence, find someone who's undecided, have a conversation with someone, a civil one. Let people know the truth and help bring other people out to vote. Just remind them that the freedom is at stake and how important this is, and have a human conversation and bring someone else. So remember, you're not just voting in November, you're going to bring someone with you. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Kavika. All right, we're going to sign off.